In class this afternoon, we were speaking about several groups of Native Americans, and particularly had ended up talking about one group that came out of Central America, the Mayans. There's one other group that we want to address and spend a few minutes on, and that is a group that became very important at the end of what becomes known as the Middle Ages, the Aztecs, or sometimes they're known as the Mexica. Originally, the area that is Mexico was settled by another group, however. The Toltecs arrived in about 950 of the Common Era, give or take, and a nomadic group that settled in central Mexico. They built their capital city there, a city they called Tula, T-U-L-A. Engaged in extensive agriculture with irrigation for their crops, given the conditions and so on, and a fairly sophisticated society. But eventually they were overwhelmed by another nomadic group that came out of the north, one that, as I say, is perhaps more important for us at the moment, and that would be the Aztecs, or the Mexica. They came from the north in the 1300s, and they were looking for a place to settle, and according to their gods, or at least their religious belief, they were looking for a place to settle when they found an eagle perched on a cactus holding a snake or a serpent in its talons. And when they saw that sign, they would know that they had found the place where they should settle. Well, they found it. They found it and built their capital city on a lake. It was called Lake Texcoco, T-E-X-C-O-C-O, and built their empire there. That empire eventually, of course, turned into Mexico, but the capital city that they built on the spot where they found the eagle on the cactus with the serpent in its talons was a town that they called Tenochtitlan, or Tenochtitlan. It's pronounced various ways, but that became the home base, and that is modern-day Mexico City. That is where they built it. This whole thing is memorialized, I guess, for want of a better word, in the Mexican flag to this day. If you take a look at the Mexican flag, it isn't hard to recognize the signs. There's the eagle perched on a cactus holding a snake in its talons, and of course that whole thing is sitting in the water because it is at Lake Texcoco where Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, got built. The Aztecs settled there in about 1325 of the Common Era, and within about 100 years they had become the dominant force within the central area of what is now Mexico. They conquered other tribes, they demanded land and tribute from them, as well as military service, and basically became the powerful group in what is now Mexico. An interesting society, all things considered, in terms of what they did. Politically, they were ruled by a leader who was not hereditary, or at least not fully hereditary. Rather, the ruler had to be elected by the aristocracy. But the choice was limited to a certain number of people that were born into an aristocratic ruling class, if you will. So the general class was hereditary, but the ruler himself was elected, and he now had to prove himself as a worthy leader, and the way he did that was to, once he was elected, to take on an advisor. He and the advisor took control of the government, and at that point the governing council had no further power. The one that had elected him to office now held no further authority, and he went out and negotiated tribute arrangements with the various dependencies that had been conquered by the Aztec people and so on. Interestingly, the ruler of the Aztec people had both civil and religious authority, but the key here was that he had to prove his worth, almost a divine mandate, if you will, and he did that by military conquest. And so the ruler would go out and conquer new peoples and expand the territory and the size of the empire, and did so really as almost a religious and civic mandate in order to prove his worth. The rulers and the power of the rulers and the Aztec empire in general peaked really under the rule of a guy by the name of Montezuma II, actually, in the early 1500s. The society was a fairly sophisticated one. They had local markets where they traded with people around them. They also had a very large central market in a place called Tlatelolco, Tiateloco, which was used primarily for long-distance trade, for luxury goods, chocolate being one of the ones that they considered a true luxury. Who can argue with that, right? And so on. Tenochtitlan became a major city, filled with large pyramid structures, grid streets like the Indus River Valley. They had a zoo, they had a library, all sorts of marks of sophistication, as well as very complicated, complex agricultural systems. They built dikes, which they used to separate salt water from fresh water in the lake, so they were able to grow their crops. They built their crops and actually expanded their space that could be cultivated by constructing large platforms that floated in the lake, and so they increased their area that way, notwithstanding the ability to segregate salt and fresh water, build platforms for growing and so on. They were only able to get about 3/4 of the food they needed that way. They still had to get 1/4 of their food from tribute from the people that they conquered. And so indeed that's exactly what they ended up doing. It was a relatively hierarchical society, particularly as they went forward. At the top of society were the nobles. Underneath them were the priests and the military. Underneath them, everybody else in society. But a kind of an interesting society in the sense that they're very divided in terms of how they lived. The nobility, for example, had 2-story houses. The peasantry lived in a 1-story house. The nobility ate protein and chocolate. The peasants subsisted almost entirely on grain. The nobility was allowed to be polygamous. They had multiple wives. The peasantry was forced to be monogamous. 1 wife per man, that was it. They dressed differently, and so it went. You could walk down the street, and by the neighborhood, by the people that you looked at and so on, there would be no question whether you were looking at the nobility or the peasantry who you were dealing with. Very definitely split between them in terms of how that functioned. Religiously, again, like most of the societies we've talked about, a polytheistic society. A little different in the sense that they divided their gods into 3 divisions, for want of a better word. There was one group of gods that were responsible for fertility. So they were gods of maize and water and agriculture and so on. A second group of gods were involved in warfare and sacrifice. And the third group of gods were the gods of creation. Most notably, the most powerful two, the god of the sun and the god of the night sky. And it was their conflict and structure or stress that gave structure to Aztec society in ways. The sun god was a guy by the name of Huitzilopochtli. And Huitzilopochtli was forced as the sun god to battle the forces of darkness on a daily basis. Every day, according to Aztec belief, the sun god was born at dawn and began to rise in the sky. And he crossed the sky, but then died, if you will, in a sense at least, in the evening, when the sun god returned to Mother Earth to regain his strength and be prepared to fight the forces of darkness again for another day. The key, of course, was that he needed to be nourished in order to regain that strength, or else the Aztecs would be plunged into permanent darkness. And how do you nourish a sun god? Well, you do that with human sacrifice, most notably with human hearts. Probably a belief that was picked up from the Mayans. If you remember, we talked a little bit about sacrifice being part of the Mayan ritual. Well, now it became a huge part of the Aztec ritual. They would, on a daily basis, sacrifice victims at the top of a pyramid to give their heart to Huitzilopochtli so that he was able to survive and fight another day. And that became an integral part of their belief. And so one of the reasons why the new leader had to go out and conquer new territory was to fulfill one of the major jobs of the military, and that was to supply sacrificial victims for the sun god. Sun food, if you will, in a manner of speaking. It also becomes a form of political control and terror over the people that they conquer. But the key was that they would conquer people and take back members of that group and use them as sacrificial victims to the sun god. So they don't kill their victims. One of the things about Aztec warfare is that it's not as deadly. Their weaponry and so on was predicated on the need to capture people alive, to disable them, to perhaps injure them, but to bring them in one piece, if you will, to become a sun food at the end of the day in Tenochtitlan. They also believed that all of life on Earth was a cycle, that the world was destroyed and recreated multiple times. Again, something that probably was picked up from the Mayans in terms of the belief system. In the case of the Aztecs, however, they had some pretty specific ideas. Most notably, they knew that the next year in which the gods were going to come to destroy the earth and then recreate it again, as had been done in the past, would be in the year 1519. Not, of course, a term they would use. 1519, of course, is a European concept of time, but that's the time period in which the world was to be destroyed. The gods would come back and take back the world and then recreate everything. The result, as we will see in the next unit, is pretty significant. When Cortez and the Spanish came in, conveniently enough, 1519, they came as strangers across the ocean on strange beasts, wearing armor, speaking a strange tongue. They had gunpowder weaponry, things that the Aztecs had never seen before. And so they were quite convinced, at least initially,